Hey there, guys. This is Cole. Welcome back to another movie review for the month of October. Today's horror movie I'm going to be reviewing, we are on Halloween Horror Movie Reviews, Season 1, Episode 25. And today's movie I'm going to review is the 1985 horror movie adaptation of the H.P. Lovecraft story, Re-Animator. Now, this is a movie that I first saw this movie about 5 years ago, and I liked it, but it had been a while since I last watched it, and I decided to review it recently because, interesting fact, a YouTuber that I really like, Cody Leach, he actually has a video planned for this October 31st called 31 on 31 The Infected, where he is going to rank 31 zombie movies together all in one video. And this is going to be one of the movies included on that list. So I figured might as well review the movie if it's going to be alongside the list. And I'm also going to be doing that 31 on 31 video. And I already have a premiere for it set on my channel. So stay tuned for that. But yeah. Now, like I said, this is based on an H.P. Lovecraft story. And for those of you guys who don't know, I am a big H.P. Lovecraft is a horror book author that, he's made many stories I enjoy. His most iconic when it comes to H.P. Lovecraft, his most well-known iconic story is the 1928 science fiction horror book, The Call of Cthulhu, which is a book that has 13 chapters and 100 pages, which I own it right here in like this collection here with The Call of Cthulhu and other stories, which I got this book for $20 and it comes with The Call of Cthulhu, but it also comes with like 9 different stories. So yeah, I'm a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, and I also, now I'm not going to pull it off my shelf at the moment, but I also own a separate copy of one of H.P. Lovecraft's books called The Shadow Out of Time, which is a really good sci-fi horror book from the 1930s. And like I said, the most well-known iconic book that H.P. Lovecraft has written is the 1928 science fiction horror book, The Call of Cthulhu, which is this giant octopus monster you see here. And I really like that book. Essentially, the premise is it's basically about a police detective named Francis Wayland Thurston who's investigating like these murders that are done by a cult, and the cult worships the giant creature Cthulhu. In fact, Cthulhu is so popular that he's even been made into stuffed plushies, and I have a Cthulhu plushie. But enough about that. Let's get into, talking about Re-Animators. So, anyways, what is the plot to the 1922 movie Re-Animator? Well, sorry, I meant to say 1985 movie, Re-Animator, but so the plot of this movie is as follows. At the University of Zurich, Herbert West brings his dead professor back to life. Following the horrific side effects involved in the procedure, West moves to the U.S. to further his studies based on the 1922 short story by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, like I said, I am a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, but when it comes to the 1922 short story Re-Animator, it's one of the few H.P. Lovecraft stories that I have not read or listened to the audiobook of, so whether this movie is an accurate representation of it, I can't say, but I'm judging this movie on its own terms, and I really liked this movie. Now, how was this movie received? Well, when this movie was released in the U.S. on October 18th, 1985, it received positive reviews from critics and audiences, and it made $2 million worldwide on a $900,000 budget, and has become a huge cult classic over the years. Now, as for my reaction to the movie, yeah, Re-Animator is definitely a horror classic, and of the few we've gotten, I would say this is definitely the best, at least of the ones that I've seen so far. It's definitely the best movie adaptation of an H.P. Lovecraft story. But anyways, let's get to the review. So, how does this movie start off? Well, the movie starts off in a mental asylum where Dr. Carl's room is approached by security guards who hear him screaming. So they go inside the security room and they see Herbert West holding a syringe by his neck. The cops try to escort Herbert out of the room with no luck, and the doctor keeps screaming with blood coming out of his mouth. A pale face with his eyes, and a pale face with his eyes, gouging themselves out, which is a rather effective scene. And, I love the whole part when the Swiss doctor woman says, "You killed him," and then Herbert West says, "No, I gave him life." Very intense way to start off the movie. And this is a kind of a backtracking thing. But anyways, let's get back to the reviews. So, we then cut to Miskatonic Medical School in Arkham, Massachusetts, where doctors are trying to keep an unconscious person alive. We are then introduced to Dr. Kane, and we find out the woman Dr. Kane was trying to keep alive flatlined. And one thing I will say that does work really well about this movie, not only does this movie have a great story, but it has a great set of characters played wonderfully by the cast. You got Jeffrey Combs as the main character, Herbert West. You got Bruce Abbott as Dr. Kane. You got Barbara Crampton as Megan. You got Robert Sampson as Dean Hasley. You got David Gale as Dr. Carl Hill. So, really good cast. We are then introduced to Megan Hasley, played by Barbara Crampton, who agrees to work with Herbert and Dr. Kane. And so basically, Megan basically asks Herbert, what are you studying? And then Herbert basically tells her, "I am studying death and I'm fascinated with it," and stuff like that. We then cut to a scene where Herbert and his two partners are at the hospital watching Dr. Carl Hill perform a demonstration on how to make an incision. And Dr. Carl Hill says these exact words: "You make the incision at the base of the skull, cutting away enough of fascia to get your fingers in, and then grasping firmly with both hands, you pull the skin in forward over the head, very much like peeling a large orange." And, people kind of laugh at what he says. Once the skull is plainly visible, you take the bone saw and you cut around the perimeter. And there you have it, ladies and gentlemen, the human brain. Once the brainstem of an individual, I'm talking about the reticular activating system, heart regulation, respiratory system. Once these activities cease, the brain can only survive an additional 6 to 12 minutes until brain-deaf brains, an irreversible conclusion. We all want to retain our personalities in some idyllic afterlife. We all pray for some miracle, some drug, potion, pill. Perhaps, though, it takes something else. Perhaps it takes an observed desire. And we cut to the scene, I love the part when Herbert West where he basically interrupts Dr. Carl Hill by snapping a pencil in half, which is the third time he's done it to distract everyone. And then I love the part after that when Dr. Carl stares at him and says, "We will discuss this another time. Mr. West, I suggest you get yourself a pen." Like, that scene was funny with the way it was executed. Then Herbert West says to him, how could you teach such drivel? These people are here to learn. You are closing their minds before they even have a chance. You should have stolen more of Gruber's ideas. Then at least you would actually have ideas." Then Dr. Carl Hill says, "Mr. West, it is going to be a pleasure failing you." And throughout the course of the movie, Herbert West is fascinated with death and the idea of bringing stuff back from the dead. I thought that Dr. Kane and Megan Hasley were great characters that had good chemistry with each other. And, you definitely buy their friendship throughout the course of the movie. Of course, there's the whole part where they are on the couch and Megan is discussing her concern for Herbert West, and she says, "I'm a little concerned. West is always in the room with the door closed. Do you ever see him? Does he ever eat?" And then Dr. Kane says, "I told you he's a little cracked." Then Megan says, "Rufus is terrified of him. When West comes in, he runs and hides." And Rufus is their pet cat, by the way. And Megan, and then, Megan then gets concerned as she has not seen or heard the cat all day. Dan and Megan then call for the cat. She then sneaks into Herbert's room and finds the cat dead in the fridge. And Megan, despite Herbert claiming he found the cat dead, she blames Herbert for the cat's death, and Dan finds out about it too. And then so Herbert basically says to the two people dating, he says these exact words, basically telling them what happened to the cat. He says, "It knocked over the garbage and it got its head stuck in a jar. You weren't home, so I put it in there. I certainly didn't think you would want to find it like that. I did not want to stink the place up. I was going to show you. But then Don finds a weird green liquid in a jar and asks Herbert, what is it? But Herbert says, it's none of your business, just like it's none of my business that you were sleeping with Dean Hasley's daughter, and by the way, Megan's an adult, but Megan's dad is the professor of that university. But then both let Herbert be and, go back to what he was doing. Later that night, Dan is woken up by a strange sound, and he tries to get Herbert, who doesn't answer him. Then the cat, which was brought back from the dead as a reanimated corpse, attacks Herbert and Dan. After it is destroyed, Herbert then says, "Watch out," and then he's maniacally laughing. Herbert decides to tell Dan his theory of reanimation. He then says Dan needs his help to do this, and it could be his chance to be famous. And at first, he's not on board with it, but then he eventually reluctantly agrees. But anyways, Herbert then uses a syringe and green liquid, which reanimates the cat, but the cat cannot move its body, but it meows. But that's because, they got into a fight. They were trying to get the cat off the body, and, well, the cat essentially broke its back to where it could meow but when it was reanimated, but that was about it. The next day, Dan tells Dean, aka the college professor's daughter, who is Megan's dad, who is in charge of Miskatonic University. He basically tells the professor that Herbert reanimated the cat, but Dean thinks that Dan is insane, and then tells him to tell Herbert that he's no longer a student at the university. And then so, later that night, Herbert and Dan sneak into the place at 10:33 p.m. in the autopsy room. Then Dan decides to go in the building, and he basically meets up with the lady who checks in people at the front desk, and then and then she's told that that Herbert and Dan went upstairs, but then obviously the professor's not happy with this, and then he says to her, I told Dan to suspend him. But then Megan wants to go upstairs, but the dad tells her to stay put. And there's the whole scene where Herbert successfully reanimates a human corpse. Then the zombie busts down the door after, and then there's the whole scene where Herbert West and his partner are trying to fight the zombie off, and eventually the zombie does bust down the door, and it manages to bite the college professor, Dean. It bites his finger off, and then Herbert stops the zombie by using a bone saw. A rather well done scene, with a lot of really good practical effects. And one thing I will say that does work about the movie is the story and the practical effects. Like granted, I know this was based on a short story and the book for this was written in the 1920s, but what I like about this movie is basically the best way I could describe this movie for how it is tone-wise for those who haven't seen it. It is like a mix it's basically like a mix of Frankenstein, Evil Dead, and a little bit of Pet Sematary all rolled into one movie. That's the best way I can sum up this movie. But then, anyways, Herbert then tells Dan that he basically tells Dan they can bring they can bring the professor back to life, and then Dr. Hasley, aka the professor, is brought back to life, and basically the professor is he's basically put in a padded room wearing a straitjacket and stuff like that. And then Megan goes upstairs and finds out her dad, finds her dad as a zombie, but she doesn't know what's wrong with him. And then the guy who was interrupted by Herbert, which is Dr. Carl Hill, basically tells Megan, until we know what happened, he has to stay here. And he says, I have to take a look at the frontal lobe to determine what happened. And then, and Megan's like, okay. And then later that night, Dan tells Megan that her dad is dead. And Megan is in disbelief and devastated, rightfully so. And the guy who said to Megan, I want to keep your dad here, aka Dr. Carl Hill, is in Herbert's room looking around, and the guy, Dr. Carl Hill, who, like I said, was the one who told Megan that her dad had to stay there, is in Herbert West's room looking under a microscope, and Dr. Carl Hill basically tells Herbert, listen, you're gonna have to do exactly what I say. And then of course there's the whole scene where Dr. Carl Hill is looking under a microscope and he's fascinated at what he sees, and when he's not looking, Herbert West basically manages to destroy Carl Hill, ending him with a shovel in a rather gruesome scene. And then and again, really good practical effects. Then, of course, there is the whole iconic scene where Herbert uses his syringe to reanimate Dr. Carl's head. I love, and I gotta say, I like this scene because, there's the whole scene where where Herbert is sitting down and he's basically asking Dr. Carl, who granted, the only part of Dr. Carl that we see at the moment is currently his head, which is in a tray, but Dr. Carl's body is walking behind Herbert. But in this scene, Herbert asks Dr. Carl how he's feeling, and then I love the part when the head says, you, B-A-S-T-A-R-D, and then the corpse just knocks him out, and then basically steals the head and, leaves. Rather good scene. Especially well done with practical effects. But then Dr. Carl goes to the padded up room where Dean is at, and he basically stares at the Professor Dean through the window and says, it's time for you to come out now. Dr. Carl Hill then wears a mask, a plastic mask, to cover up the fact he's a zombie, and he basically walks out in the hallway, but basically Dr. Carl Hill has his reanimated head inside a bag. He's carrying it, but he basically put a fake plastic mask over his head that looks so perfect, unless you took the mask off, you wouldn't know that it was something walking without a head. And then anyways, that reanimated corpse of the professor, he goes into the room and he puts it in the container that Herbert West did earlier. Dan then meets up with Megan, and Dan tells Megan he loves her. Then Dr. Dean Hasley's zombie breaks through the door and tries to attack Megan. Then there's the whole scene where Megan is passed out, and Dean demands Dr. Carl Hill to strap down Megan on the table. Then Herbert and Don meet up to go rescue Megan. Megan then wakes up realizing the situation around her, and Dr. Carl Hill is licking Megan, saying, "You will love me." And then Herbert West shows up saying, "I am very disappointed in you, Dr. Hill. You steal the secret of life and death. And here you are trying, and here you are trying with trysting with the bubble-headed code. You're not even a second-rate scientist." But then Dr. Hill says, "Mr. West, I'm actually glad to see you." And then Herbert says, "You'll never get credit for my discovery. Who's going to believe me? Who's going to believe a talking head? Who's going to believe a talking head getting a slideshow?" But then, basically, Dr. Herbert West says, "I have a plan," and then the bad guy, which is the reanimated corpse of the professor, says, "So do I." And then all of the dead bodies come back to life under Dr. Hill's control. Then Herbert, Megan, and Dan basically plan to escape. After Dan escapes, Megan is passed out, and Dan brings her to the doctor's room so the doctors can try to wake her up. And then we find out that she flatlined. She's dead. And then, Dan, understandably so, is devastated. Once the doctors leave the room, Dan decides to use a syringe to reanimate Megan at the end of the movie. And so, yeah, that's how the movie ends. Pretty good movie overall. Now, I have not seen the sequels yet, but the movie didn't really answer what happened to Herbert West. But I have, however, heard that Herbert West is in the second. Now, they did make 2 sequels to this movie. I heard the sequels weren't as good, but they're not going to be included in this 31 on 31 because Cody Leach didn't include them. So I'm just ranking the movies that they decided to rank. Are the sequels good? Let me know in the comments below if I should check out the sequels. But the first one I do really like. I will say the ending is a bit abrupt, but that's really my only negative. Other than that, Re-Animator from 1985 is a great horror film, and it's definitely a classic worth watching in the October season. And I'm going to give Re-Animator a 9 out of 10. So yeah. Anyways, guys, thanks for watching my review. And next up, soon, I will be covering the original Night of the Living Dead and the Stephen King movie, Misery. But until then, we'll catch you guys later. Bye-bye now.